Honorable Minister, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, there is a written version of my intervention which, for all purposes, is the real one. But as I feel very emotional about these questions, I prefer to talk out of the Kopf. So if I say something that is wrong, please, you revert to the written text. We are preparing a World Humanitarian Summit. And the first question is it necessary? I would say it's more necessary than ever. What we are witnessing today is a dramatic gap between humanitarian needs and the resources available to cater for those needs. First of all, from the point of view of conflict, a multiplication of new conflicts. Since the last year, South Sudan, the Ukraine, Libya again, Iraq with the new developments that took place, Central African Republic, now Nigeria. At the same time, a mega crisis, the Syria-Iraq crisis, the worst humanitarian crisis of modern times, and obviously the biggest threat to regional stability and to global peace and security. And the old crises never die. Afghanistan is there, Somalia is there, the Democratic Republic of Congo is there. So needs are growing exponentially. For the first time since the Second World War, more than 50 million people displaced by conflict. And if you look at the growth, 2011, 14,000 people displaced by conflict a day in the world. 14,000, 1-4. 2012, 23,000. 2013, 32,000. Needs are growing exponentially, and displacement is just one symptom, but resources available are not growing comparatively. And on the other hand, now we have climate change, population growth, urbanization, food insecurity, water scarcity. All these things are getting combined together in the world, and more needs are coming, not from man-made conflict, but also from natural disasters, from the desertification of entire areas of the planet, and from, again, more and more populations that do no longer have the conditions to live in the areas where they were born and have to flee and are submit to tragic impacts in their rights and in their lives. And this discussion is particularly relevant in the Muslim world. If you look at displacement, for instance, 2/3 of the world's refugees are Muslim, and they are hosted generously by Muslim countries. There is this idea that the refugees want to go to the rich countries. 90% of the refugees in the world are in the developing world, and it's with countries like Jordan, with Palestinian refugees, Iraqi refugees, Syrian refugees. It's thanks to the generosity of countries like Jordan that it is possible to cope with this gigantic challenge of displacement we are facing today. So it's clear we need a universal humanitarian multilateral system that should be able to respond to these dramatic needs. The point is that today's humanitarian system is no longer able, as it is today, to respond to these dramatic situations. And what we are seeing is that for those that believe that, well, there's no problem that we have wars because humanitarians will come and clean up the mess and pick up the pieces. There's no way we can clean up the mess. There is no way we can pick up the pieces. The truth is that there are today humanitarian gaps that are not addressed. There is people suffering that have no adequate response to their suffering. Now, we need a truly universal system based on universal values, being able to be accountable, but being also able to be effective and to be needs-based, and to be a system that is well-funded, that has the resources that are necessary to respond to this crisis. Now, let's be clear. We do not have today this global universal humanitarian system based on a set of global humanitarian values and able to respond to all these crises. We have a multilateral system that is centered in the UN. It is not entirely global. We have many other organizations in parallel with it. One important question is to discuss to what extent it is truly universal. But let's be clear, I think we need to be frank. The multilateral humanitarian system centered in the UN that was created after the Second World War was at the time essentially a Western system. And if I would say that it has changed, and many of our organizations like mine have done our best to make them universal and based on universal values, the truth is that if we cannot talk of a completely Western-dominated system, there is still a Western-inspired system. And the truth is that if you look at, for instance, most of the international NGOs that are relevant in today's public discourse, they still are Western. And most of because the system is funded voluntarily, most of the voluntary donors of this multilateral system are still Western countries. And so, to a certain extent, there is a central question, which I believe will be very important for our humanitarian summit, how to transform this system that is already multilateral, but it's not yet truly universal, in a truly universal system and based on effective universal values. And this question of values is very important. I would concentrate my intervention on two areas, the values and the funding. When I came to UNHCR, I was convinced that the key instrument for refugee protection in the world was the 51 Convention, establishing international law for the protection of refugees. And then one of the first visits I made was to Jordan. And Jordan is not a signatory to the convention, but Jordan has more refugees than many of the countries that are signatories to the convention. And I soon discovered that everything that is today in the 51 Convention was already established in the Holy Quran and in the Hadith of the Prophet, may peace be upon him. Everything. To the extent that we did together with the OIC a book on the roots of modern refugee law in Islamic law. But everything is there. The principle of non-refoulement. The asylum seeker, al-Mustamin, comes to seek for protection, and there is the institution of Aman, safety, guaranteeing that he will not be sent back to where he might be facing persecution. The protection not only of the person, but of the property and of the family. The civilian and humanitarian character of asylum. The asylum seeker, the al-Muslimin, shall not carry weapons. It's very clear. It's in the holy texts. Which means there is nothing in modern refugee law that was not already in Islamic law. And so, for me, it was clear that independently of the way translations are made, and sometimes we are kind of prisoners of words. There are different words with the same substance in different languages that mean exactly the same. Independently of those tricky things of translation here and there, I remember the book that we have done together with the OIC in the Arabic version took 9 months to be translated properly into English to make sure that there were no mistakes. But the truth is that independently of those tricky things of translation, the substance was the same. The principles were the same. And it is clear for me that as important as modern international refugee law is the roots in Islamic law and Islamic tradition, and even before, in the traditions of the Arabian Peninsula that to a certain extent inspired the doctrines of Islam from the beginning. And if you look at other religions, you have, the Holy Family of Christianity fled like refugees to Egypt. You have in the Leviticus of the Torah a clear indication that the foreigner should be treated like a citizen of the country. You have in the central mantra of guest as God in the Upanishads, the central Hindu book, the same concept. You have the karuna concept in Buddhism. And so, I mean, refugee protection was not invented after the Second World War. It was not invented when the 51 Convention was drafted. This is deeply rooted in the culture, in the religion, in the tradition of many civilizations around the world. And if this is true for refugee protection, it needs to be true for international humanitarian law and for the principles of humanitarian action. Now, here I am entering into areas where I'm not so much an expert, but I have to say that I was amazed to discover, when we talk about international humanitarian law, and when we talk about the rules established by international humanitarian law, again, if we go to the Holy Quran and to the Hadith of the Prophet, may peace be upon him, you find the essential things there. Clearly, it is forbidden to kill non-combatants, to do harm to non-combatants. It is forbidden to destroy non-military objectives. There are certain limitations on the way warfare is conducted. Prisoners should be treated with humanity. So, again, there is no contradiction. We can discuss sometimes questions of translation of words, but there is no contradiction between the principles of international humanitarian law and the principles deeply rooted in Islam. And if one looks now into the humanitarian aid principles, impartiality, neutrality, and independence, a needs-based approach, I have to say that when I look, and I know that it's not exactly the same I'm talking about, but when I look at one of the three pillars, one of the five pillars of Islam, the third pillar of Islam, the zakat, it is very clear that it should be used on a needs-based approach, without a hidden agenda, to the extent that there is a principle I would like to see in humanitarian aid, which is the principle of not making propaganda about what one does, but that is clearly in the holy texts. When the Prophet, may peace be upon him, says that the best almsgiving is when the hand that gives is done in a way that the other hand doesn't know. And as we know, sometimes in humanitarian aid, in modern times, there is a lot of concerns about visibility, which shows that in Islam we have much more pure principles than the ones that we sometimes have in modern times. But the way the 8 categories of people that should be the beneficiaries of zakah is defined clearly on a needs-based approach, and is, in my opinion, fully compatible. Speaking about the poor and the needy, I believe the names are Fukara and Masakin, if I'm correct. It is clear that this is not to be given to serve political objectives or to serve hidden agendas. It is to be given to those that are in need, based on a principle of impartiality, which is the one that guarantees the purity of the act, that contributes to the purification of the person that does it. The only benefit for the one that gives is its own spiritual improvement, its own spiritual purification. So again, I do not see any problem between what are today the principles of international humanitarian aid and what exists since always in relation to Islamic tradition and Islamic law. And the same could be said about other cultures, other religions, other areas of the world. And what this demonstrates is that if we do not have the arrogance, and sometimes there is a Western arrogance, trying to use the Western systems and translate them directly, without taking into account the history, the culture, the principles of other civilizations. If we are able to understand each other, to see the depths of the motivations of each other, I think we will come very quickly to the conclusion that there are indeed world, global, universal humanitarian values. Probably we need to be careful about the way to write them in the different languages. The system is very Anglo-Saxonic. Even for me that come from a Latin country, sometimes I have difficulties to adjust to the system. I believe in Arabic it's even more complicated. But that doesn't matter. What matters is the substance. And indeed the substance shows that there are universal values. And again, when we discuss these things, there is always people coming, oh, but we need to be careful. You need to be careful because sometimes in the Islamic world, I'm going to be very frank, in the Islamic world, humanitarian aid can be diverted for political purposes or purposes of military action or whatever. Well, it might be true, but is it a problem of the Islamic world? I mean, if one looks at, for instance, the Afghanistan or the Iraq operations, there was always the idea of the hearts and minds and there were the famous PRTs, which were forms of humanitarian action and development action linked to military objectives. So this is indeed a problem, but it is not a problem in the Islamic world. It's a general problem. We need a vigilance to make sure that we preserve the purity of the humanitarian principles, that we preserve the autonomy of the humanitarian space, that we separate things. Of course, in the world, there are military actions. In the world, there are security concerns. But the humanitarian, what is in the humanitarian principles as expressed today in the Interagency Standing Committee and what it is behind the idea of, for instance, the zakah is not obviously to serve an hidden agenda or a military purpose or a political purpose, is to do something out of the value of that generosity, of the value of that solidarity. So I am a true believer that there are universal values, and if there are universal values, there is a way, even if they can be translated differently in different languages, and even if we have to respect those differences, there is a way to build from what we have now a truly universal humanitarian system. But to do that, we all need to make a number of concessions. I mean, I believe probably the Interagency Standing Committee needs to be reformed to take into account the universality of humanitarian aid. I believe that we need to effectively coordinate what we are doing. And sometimes, let's be honest, when I see what's happening in this part of the world with the crisis, I see organizations on the ground doing different things and not talking to each other and not coordinating with each other. I mean, if we have the same values, if we have the same principles, let's bring our capacities together. Let's indeed make sure there are no gaps and overlaps. Let's indeed make sure that there is effective coordination, which does not mean that the UN way of coordinating now needs to be accepted by everybody. No, it means that we need to consult, to see the diversity of what is on the ground and to see how we can come together in the most effective way to be able to deliver to the people we all care for. So, there is a way to go. It will not be automatic. And there will be suspicions, and there will be sometimes lack of comprehension. But we need to be always reminding something, that we are here not because of us, we are not important. The important people are the people we care for. And it is for the people we care for that we are supposed to act. And the people we care for demand that we join our efforts to be able to act together and to put everything together. And we need to put everything together because we are in trouble. And now I come to the funding question. We are in big trouble. If one looks at what's happening today, one will see that there are enormous gaps that are not being filled. our sister agency, the World Food Programme, has dramatically cut food assistance in several parts of the world. In this region, in refugee camps around the world, and to other populations, and they simply have not the funds to be able to cope with this dramatic. It's the most basic of the requirements. It's food, and they don't have the money for that. And if we see what is happening in many other areas, we see the same gaps, the same problems. The international humanitarian system, as it is today, I would say, is facing financial bankruptcy. Before coming last week, I took the decision to reduce the expenditure that we had already authorized in UNHCR by 7% across the board, in order to be able to have the funds for those dramatic situations that cannot be abandoned in any case. And we are reducing as much as we can our own costs, and it is obvious that we need to do so. We need to be more effective, we need to be more efficient, we need to be more innovative. But independently of that, the truth is that needs have been growing in a way that has not been followed by funds. How can we address this? I would say that there are three things that need to be put on the table. One is to bring together different forms of support and to be able, if not to merge them, at least to guarantee an effective coordination. And I'd like to praise Kuwait for the fact that for the first time we have a very serious commitment of a country from the Gulf to be central in the way the multilateral financial system works. And this has given Kuwait an enormous influence in the way the multilateral financial system works. But it is not only that needs to be done. There are lots of other forms of funding that need to be put together, not to fund the same organizations, to make sure that covering all the organizations on the field of the different nature, there is an effective complementarity, and we are able not to have any gaps or any overlaps. The need to really increase the funds available and to improve the way they are used through better coordination, to reduce overheads everywhere, and we have done it quite substantially in my own organization, to make sure that the money that is available is for the people we care for, not to feed bureaucracies. To do this is essential, and it is one first aspect I would like to underline. A second is we need to bring development cooperation much closer to humanitarian aid. And this is a central question in today's world. There is about 8 to 10 times the humanitarian money in development cooperation. And the truth is that in most of the crisis situations that require immediate action, part of the problem is not humanitarian. In Jordan, we have very serious structural problems. In education, in health, in water, in sanitation, in other infrastructure. There is no way humanitarian money can address it. And of course, in the Jordanian response, you have humanitarian resilience and the government projects. It's absolutely essential that the international community, the development cooperation part of the international community, forgets about this crazy idea that Jordan cannot receive a certain number of instruments because it's a middle-income country. My God, I mean, it's a middle-income country. Of course it is, thanks to the efforts of the Jordanian people. But with challenges that are out of proportion with many other countries around the world. And more important than that, Jordan is not only a country with a dramatic impact in its economy and its society. The same could be said about Lebanon. The truth is that Jordan today, and the same about Lebanon or about Cameroon or Niger, are countries that are the first line of defense of the international community in relation to collective security. And this is something that needs to be put in the priorities of development cooperation policies. Of course, Millennium Development Goals are very important. Eradication of poverty is very important. The questions related to fragile states are very important. But to be able to bring development cooperation into this crisis situation and to allow for those countries that are the pillars of stability in this context to be able to move through is absolutely essential, and there is no way we can do it with humanitarian money. Development cooperation money needs to be brought into the equation and needs to be brought since the beginning of any crisis. And then third, and this is a very controversial suggestion, all the humanitarian funding until now has been voluntary. But peacekeeping, for instance, is funded by assessed contributions, is funded through the UN budget by mandatory contributions of the different states. I think that eventually we should be looking into the need of, at least for the biggest emergencies, like the Syria emergency or the Iraq emergency or the South Sudan emergency, now in the UN jargon, the L3 emergencies, to have part of its humanitarian response funded by assessed contributions. Because it is a collective responsibility of the whole world. It's not just based on the goodwill of a number of traditional donors. And so we believe that humanitarian funding needs to be revisited. And Valerie Amos and I made a suggestion to the Secretary General, and I believe is appointing a panel of personalities to look seriously into these questions and to come with a number of proposals to the international community. But let me be very clear. If fundamental changes are not introduced in the way humanitarian aid is funded and in the way solutions and structural problems created by humanitarian problems are addressed, the system will not be able to respond. The system is already not able to respond today. So I would say I'm very optimistic about the capacity of humanitarians to come together, to respect each other, to understand that even with different languages, we have the same principles indeed. I am a little bit more worried that the international community will not be able to do all the reforms that are necessary in order to guarantee that there is adequate funding for the dramatic needs we are facing. But I think it's the role of all of us in all the areas where we can be active, in the civil society, in government, in international organizations, to do everything possible to say the truth is that with wars multiplying as much as they are multiplying, with the international community lacking the capacity to prevent conflicts and to timely solve them, with climate change and all the other new challenges of the present times, humanitarian needs will be growing in the next decades in a dramatic way, and we simply do not have the resources to respond to those needs. We have a humanitarian system that, of course, needs to do better, needs to improve, needs to reform, but that has not the resources needed for the people we care for the people that is suffering so much, and not the resources necessary to support those countries, like Jordan, that are providing the first line of protection of those in need and the first line of defense of the collective global security.